So I'm Mark Bragdon, head of the Research Commons, and I'm happy to be presenting the second booster session in a series that's intended to introduce you to people, methods, strategies, and expertise at UNB libraries, where our mission is to share in your success. Not share in your success so much, but play a role in your success. Your success is all yours. So today we have 3 talks, each lasting 15 minutes, so taking us through 45 minutes, and then with a little bit of Q&A at the end. Richelle Witherspoon, Information Services Librarian with primary responsibilities with the Faculty of Nursing, Faculty of Kinesiology, will be presenting on systematic reviews. Josh Dickerson, our head of the Digital Delivery Department, which some of you may know in part as Interlibrary Loans, as well as our Copyright Officer, is going to be speaking on copyright matters in graduate research and publishing. And Nicole Slipp, who is librarian for business, humanities, and languages, will be speaking on accessible video. So those of you joining virtually will notice that you have no video or microphone capabilities, but there is a Q&A box. And so if you want to use that to log questions as you go, we're going to be addressing those after all 3 speakers have spoken. And please note that this session is being recorded so that those who were not able to come or who would wish to review later will have an opportunity to do so.
Okay, so whenever we advertise workshops and resources on this topic, we refer to them as systematic reviews because that's the popular term and the one that most people recognize. A more accurate title for this talk, however, and that didn't work, is An Introduction to Knowledge Synthesis. Knowledge synthesis is a more inclusive heading that captures the dozens of types of reviews that all share a set core of methodologies. And that, in addition to systematic reviews, also includes umbrella reviews, clinical guidelines, rapid reviews, scoping reviews, meta-analyses, and many more. The purpose of a knowledge synthesis is to take all of the available evidence on a topic and, if there's enough of it, to draw robust conclusions that are less vulnerable to the systemic flaws that affect other forms of research. The success of a knowledge synthesis, then, is in having enough evidence, which begs the question of how much evidence is enough. The answer is complicated, but it all comes down to the problem of P, which is the probability that a study will falsely report that something is true. In theory, a single quantitative study will make this mistake as little as 0.001% of the time, or as often as 5% of the time, depending on the field of study, with fields like medicine obviously favoring lower rates of error and other fields being more permissive in terms of what they allow. But that's sort of like in theory, right? In practice, these error rates are much, much higher and are influenced by things like sample contamination, publication bias, researcher error, P hacking, selective reporting, and unknown or uncontrollable confounds in the study. And all of these things have an inflationary effect on this value of P. And all of these things come together to make it very difficult to trust a single study when you want to make a change. So you typically want to have multiple converging points of evidence on any given decision or policy or practice change. And that is where knowledge synthesis comes in. Knowledge syntheses look at all the existing literature on a topic, consider all the findings, and when there's enough evidence, draws conclusions based on the amount and strength of the evidence available. So what knowledge synthesis involves, and this is a really important place to start because knowledge synthesis involves a lot. And 15 minutes is not enough to tell you just how big a deal these things are, but I'll give you a quick summary and then tell you what we do at the library to support them. So, not surprisingly, knowledge synthesis involves research questions. And it sounds obvious and easy, but it's harder than people think it is. Reviews do succeed and fail based on the strength of their research question. The question has to be specific enough that you can actually review all of the evidence on it. but broad enough that there is enough evidence on it to review. It needs to be clear and unbiased. Typically, it needs to be open-ended, so there's no yes or no questions. And it needs to be searchable and answerable, which are hard to quantify, but are essential for the success of a review. Once we have a question, we need to do a search. How the search is done in knowledge synthesis is very carefully prescribed and usually requires at least consulting, if not collaborating with, a specially trained librarian like myself or my colleague in St. John, Alex Goodrow. Systematic reviews are excruciatingly thorough, retrieve research from both academic and non-academic sources, and often undergo an independent peer review process by other librarians before they're considered acceptable for review. And just to underscore what I mean when I say excruciatingly thorough, the average systematic search strategy takes 37 hours to develop, and that's just an average. I've certainly had some that have gone on for weeks. And even after spending 70 hours, it might not work and the review might fail. So they're a very intensive process to undertake. From this point forward in knowledge synthesis, things really do stay on par with that level of intensity. Every step after the search is designed, from article selection to data extraction to critical appraisal, has to be done independently and in parallel by at least 2 researchers. This 2x2 approach to review ensures that every decision is being made according to clear guidelines and makes the review process replicable in a way that standard literature reviews are not. Because of the importance, the intensity, and the significance of these 3 steps, they take up the bulk of the time of a systematic review, roughly 12 to 24 months, with article selection taking up by far the largest part of that time. And then once everything's all been done, all of that searching, all of those 2-step processes, the research team comes together and answers the question. In most cases, that answer allows for a new practice or policy or project to be implemented. Not infrequently, however, that answer is that the threshold of evidence for a topic has not been reached and that more research is needed. Yeah. Can you tell? Okay, so that's what knowledge synthesis is. Now let's talk about what it isn't. There's a lot of confusion when I talk about knowledge synthesis because the individual words have a meaning outside of the specific context I'm applying it to. So when I say knowledge synthesis or systematic review, it either sounds like something that researchers do all the time, synthesize knowledge, or something that they should absolutely be doing, reviewing the literature systematically. But knowledge syntheses really are their own thing and can be differentiated from other forms of literature review by understanding that a lit review is part of an article. A knowledge synthesis is the article. Literature reviews are scans of the literature that place a research project in context. They discuss, argue, highlight, and support the hypotheses upon which the project is based. Lit reviews make an argument for the project. Knowledge syntheses are the project and contain literature reviews that make an argument for them and place them in context. Knowledge syntheses also have their own methodology sections that describe all of the steps taken to decrease bias and ensure comprehensiveness. They do not speculate, hypothesize, or argue. They also differ from lit reviews in that a single knowledge synthesis can go through as many as 3 separate peer review processes, once at the protocol stage, once at the search development stage, and once for the final published review. Is knowledge synthesis right for you? Obviously, I can't answer that for you. I'm not you. But if you're thinking about doing a knowledge synthesis, there are a few questions you can ask yourself. Are you interested in a topic that has already been researched? Is there conflicting or confusing evidence on your research topic? Are you trying to make a recommendation that would change policy or practice within a field? Do you have a potential collaborator with experience in knowledge synthesis? And I cannot emphasize enough how important that part is. And do you have the time to complete a review? Again, reviews often take 12 to 24 months. In my experience, they take more like 18 to 30 months. So be sure that you have time to invest in this project before you start. But if you do, and if those questions are mostly answered yes in your mind, then knowledge synthesis might be right for your purposes. So the next question becomes, what kind of knowledge synthesis? So I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that there are many types of knowledge synthesis, including systematic, scoping, rapid, meta-analysis, umbrella, integrative, living, narrative, prognostic, and like 35 or plus more. So when you're deciding to do a review and you're deciding which type of review to do, the things that really play into that are the purpose of your review, the type of evidence that's available on your topic, and the breadth of the topic itself. I don't have time to go through the specifics of when to do each type of review, but I will talk about the 3 most popular ones, just so you know what they are, and then leave you to explore the rest. Scoping reviews tend to cover broad topics and are typically used to identify types of evidence available in a field, to clarify key concepts in the literature, to examine research methodologies for a certain field or topic, to identify key characteristics or factors related to a concept, to identify and analyze knowledge gaps. Scoping reviews are most often done as a standalone research project, but have also been done for introductions to very large grant applications, or as a precursor to a systematic review. Systematic reviews tend to have more specific and concrete topics, and are typically done to confirm current practice, address variations in practice, or to identify new practices, to identify or inform areas of future research, identify and investigate conflicting research findings, or to produce statements to guide decision-making. And lastly, meta-analyses are often done as part of systematic reviews. Meta-analyses can be done as parts of systematic reviews. Not all systematic reviews can include meta-analyses. And basically what they do is they add a statistical analysis of the research to the review. I'm going to take a second and take a drink. So meta-analyses can be done when the studies being reviewed are similar enough to each other for the researchers to pool the data together for further analysis. This increases the power of the review and drastically decreases the problem of P that I mentioned earlier. So how UNB Libraries can support you. UNB Libraries has 3 tiers of service for knowledge synthesis support, depending on the needs of the person asking for it. So our first tier is instruction and resources, and consists mostly of our online resources, our knowledge synthesis bootcamp, and some live instruction in courses and labs. Our second tier, which is probably the least popular, but should be much more popular than it is where we provide up to 5 hours of one-on-one support to individuals who are conducting knowledge synthesis. The service is targeted at graduate students and is intended as a way to supplement existing or developing expertise in the area of knowledge synthesis. Our third tier is collaboration, which embeds the librarian, like me, as a member of the research team and makes me responsible for the search for the project in total. This service is targeted at faculty projects and is typically not available to graduate students because the expectation at the graduate level is that you will learn and engage with the process yourselves. Okay, so in my desire to tell you about all the things that we can do to help, I kind of breezed past this really important thing. So let me talk a bit more about those resources we have for you. In particular, let me tell you about our research guide and our bootcamp. Our knowledge synthesis research guide has a lot of stuff that I talked about in the last few minutes, like our services, what a systematic review involves, and what types of reviews there are, but also includes things like how to find existing knowledge syntheses and sample reviews, and links to significant guidelines and websites. It also includes a series of recorded lectures about systematic review methodology that can serve as a good starting point for anyone thinking about doing a review. Those recorded lectures are based on our knowledge synthesis bootcamp that I offered in the spring with my colleague Alex Goudreau. Our bootcamp is made up of 5 3-hour classes, with each class consisting of a 1-hour lecture, a group activity in which we apply the skills taught in that lecture portion, and then an individual activity designed to move each attendee's project forward in an environment where there's expert advice available. It's a little early in the term for me to have started planning such a thing for next spring, but it's been popular in the last few years, so we will likely offer one in May, if not two in May and June. Details about these boot camps that we offer will be available through SGS, UNV News, and we'll send it out to specific research groups on campus that have been interested in the past. If you are interested in knowing about one, shoot me an email this spring and I'll tell you when it's going to be signed up. And in addition to all of these things that we do, there are a ton of free online resources that you can and should be referring to if you want to do a knowledge synthesis. I strongly encourage you to visit our research guide, but also the research guides at other universities that I myself make use of regularly. I also encourage you to visit the major websites for associations involved in knowledge synthesis, mainly Cochrane, JBI, and Prisma, and take a look at what they have for you. And of course, there's always me as a resource as well, so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. My email is on the screen.
Next up, we have Josh Dickerson speaking on copyright.
Great. Hi, my name is Josh Dickerson. I'm the copyright officer, as Mark aptly described earlier, with this newly minted manager of digital delivery put on the end of it, and it's sort of a pulling together of resources that the library has already offered, but recognizing some changes that are happening with digital delivery through instruction and for graduate students with your research and publication. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at copyright, which is under the umbrella of intellectual property, and how it relates to your academic research and publishing. This is the waiver. I'm no lawyer, and nobody here on campus, unless they've got a side gig going as a lawyer and had insurance to do so, are going to give you legal advice on what you can do with copyright. Copyright is the law, and you don't get to decide whether or not you've infringed someone else's copyright until the judge tells you so. So this is copyright advice. It's generally not serious enough to take it to the court, but as universities know, it can go to the Supreme Court before you finally get an answer. So it's important to know when it's legal advice and when it's some legal information. Also in here, lots of what I'm going to talk about is interpretation of the Copyright Act from the institution's perspective. So what UNB is willing to take as an interpretation of the Copyright Act takes a bit of risk and is a bit conservative in other areas. So you have to take it as the copier. You're the person who's ultimately responsible for the actions that you take in the end. Copyright. So there's copyright in law and in the contracts. In your contracts you sign with publishers, contracts that you'll sign on documents that you'll submit for publication, either with UNB or with commercial publishers. But then there's also copyright in practice and how you're going to interact on Facebook, or how you're going to interact with colleagues across the country with sharing materials as well. So there's two worlds to think about when you're thinking about distributing published material. We're going to get into a bit of the finer points of what each of those contexts mean. So copyright is the law. There's lots of gray area within copyright, but within that, that's the best picture I could find of how thick the Copyright Act is. But it is a giant piece of not literature, a giant piece of work with lots of details to it. These are the points that we can see as black and white. It's originality. It's something that you've created, and it has to have some originality to it. If I don't put enough intellectual effort into it, or sweat of the brow, I guess they call it in court, then I'm not going to get copyright protection for that. It's literary, dramatic, musical, artistic works. So it's something you fix in a format. It's not going to be an idea. There's no copyright to ideas. There's only copyright to something that is fixed, either on paper, on a napkin, through this video recording, it gets to be copyrighted. And it's automatic. I don't have to register this. I don't have to tell you that this is copyrighted. As soon as it's recorded and as soon as you've put it down in its material form, it gets to enjoy the protection of the Copyright Act, as long as it's original. So how long does it last? There's a couple of different places to apply the term of copyright. Generally for what we create in a literary work, it's going to be the life of the author plus 50 years after your death. This is important for publishers. This is important for Walt Disney and Mickey Mouse. This is important for how long the rights are going to stay in your name and someone's going to get to collect royalties off of that in lots of cases. There's also a separate set of rights with performers' performances, sound recordings, and broadcast signals. That gets 50 years after the performance has been created. So there's a couple of different scenarios to think of when you're publishing or looking for something that may no longer be in copyright, and those are the two criteria to think about. There's also some black and white in there that will be of interest to graduate students, and is works for hire. A newspaper journalist is the sort of the easiest example to think of. There are staff writers, and then there are contract writers who both contribute to the Daily Gleaner or a newspaper. The staff writer, their copyright is owned by the owner of the newspaper, say it's Brunswick News. They get to own the rights to that as your work, and it's going to last for you. Even though Brunswick News owns the rights to this work from the get-go, they own the rights for as long as you're alive, and then 50 years afterwards. Brunswick News holds that. If you're a contract writer and you've written a deal that says I'll sell this to you, newspaper publisher, and you get the luxury of publishing it first. After that, I get some rights back to it, and that's sort of a general contract that freelance newspaper article writers have. And so that's a different set of rights. You're going to hold on to it still 50 years past when you die, but you get to hold on to the rights, but the newspaper gets to use it under contract. So those are works for hire. Us as, workers for the library, everything that I write here, this fantastic presentation, all gets to belong to the library and to the university, not to me. Faculty, on the other hand, have a different agreement and get to keep their intellectual property of what they've produced. There are moral rights. Canada has moral rights, and that's something that's important to all of us in an academic setting, is that once you publish something, even though the publisher takes ownership of it and you've signed over all those rights, you still have moral rights over how this is going to be presented and where it's going. If it's, it causes a change in your opinion because they've published it in a collection that you don't agree with. It's been, you don't own the rights to sell it to this collection of works, but by being presented in that collection, it changes the meaning of that work. You have moral rights that so long as you haven't waived them, you get to say, no, I don't want it in there. But that's about it. That's all the rights you get over that once you've signed over your copyrights to the publisher. So those are important to think about and make sure you're not waiving them. If you see a contract that's coming down the line and you see moral rights and you're being asked to waive it, it's not necessary. I wouldn't recommend it. International context. Copyright applies in the country that you're in. So just because something was published in the United States that has life plus 70, because Mickey Mouse turned 70, there's life plus 70 there. When you're in Canada, you get to apply the life plus 50 because that's the Canadian rules for copyright. So in whatever country you're making the copy in, that's the copyright rules that you apply. But a note for that, with that for now indication, we've signed a new NAFTA or CUSMA, and part of that deal is that Canada has to start applying life plus 70. So it's coming down the road very soon. And then remedies, that's the last black and white thing I think is worth mentioning here, is that there are statutory remedies for it. It's got a little nuance since 2012 when they sort of made some adjustments to the Copyright Act, and it's not $20,000 per infringement as a statutory remedy, but if it's something you've done in an educational and research setting, you didn't realize you were doing it, and you've still made an infringement of the rights, it's $200 per infringement. So it sets off some of that chill as a researcher, and oftentimes it's negotiated to nothing. It's just a takedown notice. So there's not too much fear in your research and what you're doing. The courts have decided, and legislation has decided to add that caveat, thankfully. So as a user of copyrighted material, we've left the realm of you as the copyright owner, or at least the person responsible for how long there's copyrights on a work. You do get to use other people's works. As nothing's created in a vacuum, you need to be able to build off of other people's works, and that's what copyright's all about. It's about balancing those rights of the creator and of the user, and how to go forward with progress in science, I think the United States describes it as. And so our most revered user right is fair dealing. In the United States, it's fair use, so you'll hear people say fair use all the time, but it's not fair use in Canada, it's fair dealing, and that's an important point to make. So you can see in how they define what fair dealing is, that the goal of that Copyright Act is to balance this. And so with research, private study, criticism, review, news reporting, education, which is a recent ad in 2012, parody and satire, all of these uses, if that's what you're doing with the other person's work, then you don't have to ask for permission. But there are limits to that. As long as these are the reasons you're using it, education, research, which apply a lot to us, you need to think about how much you're using, how you're using it, if it's distributed behind a password protection, if you're printing only so many and it's limiting the distribution of it, and if there's going to be an alternative that you could have used instead of the copy that you made. And then really what it boils down to is, what is the financial impact of you using this work in its entirety, or the piece of it that you've used, on the publisher's rights of that material. So that's, generally that's what it's going to boil down to. And you can think to yourself, like, if this was my work and I was somebody else was sharing it, how much is that going to infringe on my intellectual property? And generally, because there is no, you'll hear 10% rules, a chapter rule, there's lots of black and white that publishers may try to apply, or institutions may try to apply, but it's a very, the example that I can't help but always think of when I'm on the spot is Hasta La Vista Baby. You can use a portion of Arnold Schwarzenegger's video, but if you use Hasta La Vista Baby, that small little snippet, that is the money maker of that video. So that goes beyond what fair dealing is. You've made a financial effect. You've taken the most important part of, say that's the most important part, but a recognizable part of that work, and you've worked off of it for your own benefit. So there's a consideration there to make this beyond just a 10% rule that is worth thinking about. There's lots of other exceptions. Libraries, archives, museums get a piece in there. That's how, when you're bringing in materials for your research, we're giving you entire articles from different schools. They're copies of materials from different libraries. Your fellow researchers are passing you material back and forth, a chapter and its copies of material. That stuff's all within what the Copyright Act has defined as fair use, or an exception. So there's no reason to hide that material, and no reason to think that what you're doing is wrong. But it's worth keeping track that you do have it. It's still a copy. In the end, lots of these rights that we have are being sort of created in the context of what's going on in publishing and teaching and research, and so they're trying to, the government is trying to keep up with technology and the ways in which we're communicating with each other. So we've got this educational rights, we've got non-commercial rights, these digital mashup rights that we can pass music back and forth and put songs to it, and we're being given these sort of new rights for the digital millennium. But in trade for that, what the publishers got was digital rights management. And digital rights management is something that as soon as you click in, as soon as you're getting some a login, or if you're coming into the library's resources, that's when you have to start stop applying what you've gotten from the Copyright Act and apply the license that you've agreed to work with. I'm going to start going a little quicker here. Copyright often gets mixed up with plagiarism, academic integrity. Your use of somebody's work is the actual copying of it and physically importing it into your own work. That's the copyright infringement. Not paraphrasing someone, not reiterating their ideas. That's not a copyright infringement. The copyright infringement is the actual copying of that content. Academic integrity, there's often no requirement within the Copyright Act to cite things in a certain way. You know, in certain fair dealing instances, if you're news reporting, you have to put a bit of a source, but there's no APA style. There's nothing in there that's crucial to how you source that material. So it's something different to think about when you're paraphrasing someone and when you're actually copying an entire image or copying an entire work of someone's. There's the publishing world where you're going to interact with a publisher. They're going to give you definitions of what you can and can't include in your article. They're going to demand that you have permissions for anything that you use, and it's a liability on their part. They're going to pass that off to you. You've signed the document that you've gotten all the permissions that you need. It's not our responsibility when Mickey Mouse comes back and is angry at you for using his image. That goes back onto your shoulders. But when you're presenting, it's a different situation. If you've got an academic conference you're going to, you can use materials that are going up on your PowerPoint presentation. I can put Mickey Mouse up here as long as it's important to my argument, and make a copy of that and show my my audience. If there's going to be conference proceedings afterwards and they're going to publish that material, that's when you have to start working on finding permissions for that material. But as you're presenting, either as an instructor or as an academic presenter, that material is available for you to share. So the other sort of context to think about is in your UMB thesis, dissertation papers that you present here, you have your full realm of fair dealing to use, and you can justify it in terms of the Copyright Act because you're the one making the copy, you're the one holding on to the responsibility of that. The publisher's not going to let you do that. So when you're writing a paper for a graduate seminar or something that's going to go within your network of research associates, that's you making the decision. It's when you go outside of that and work with a publisher they're going to dictate what they think fair dealing looks like. So it's your choice when it's your copyright, it's their choice when you're publishing under their name. And another important point to think about just quickly is that when you do write your thesis or your dissertation, lots of that content in there, you've decided what you're going to copy and include in that. But if you decide you're going to publish something outside of that thesis that is sort of from that thesis and from that dissertation, that the publisher is going to want to know, have you published this material anywhere else? And so long as you're the owner and you hold the copyrights of your thesis and you maintain that, then you can say, yes, but I give permission to it. So there's no repercussions from the publisher to say, well, you did publish that somewhere else and we need permissions from UMB thesis publisher. It's you're still holding the rights to it. So putting that stuff in your thesis and dissertation doesn't mean that you cannot further publish with it. So all of that being said, this is an important symbol for you to recognize and use in your own publication. Copyright, there's the Creative Commons is a license that you get to apply. You get to be the publisher. You get to shape what you want Copyright Act to look like. You apply that to your own publications, and then you're free to use it the way you want to. You don't have to worry about rights afterwards. Someone's not going to come to you and say, is it okay if I use your great research down the road, an instructor wanting to put it into a PowerPoint presentation? You've declared what your rights are on that publication. There's lots of information available at the library in supporting open access. If you want to publish in open access, by all means, look up Mike Nason. He's the scholarly communications librarian here, and he will be happy to talk your ear off about open access because it is it's what's helping shape where publishers are going with copyright, and it's helping academic copyright and in the digital age to come. Take away from that, it's complicated. There are so many bits and pieces to what how copyright applies, when it's going to apply when you're an instructor, when it's going to apply when you're publishing as a student, and then how you're going to use other people's work. So copyright only protects that material form of that the work. I could have explained the greatest idea about copyright yet, and you could write that down and you get to own the copyright on it. It's just the idea does not get any sort of protection. It's the physical manifestation of it. You're contracting in and out of your rights. When you publish and you put your material into a commercial journal, you're giving away that copyright. Probably the most infringing you will do is on yourself, because those works that you've given off and then you're going to continue on your research, you're going to borrow off that and you're going to have to go get the permission from the publisher. So think of that when you're publishing works and putting them entirely in the hands of commercial publishers. OA is critical to this balance of copyright in the academic ecosystem. And when in doubt, reach out. Reach out to us and at the Copyright Office, and then if all else fails, we'll push you to a legal professional to help you with it. But we're happy to chat about it. Thank you.
Okay, so as Mark just said, my name is Nicole Slipp, and I'm going to be talking over some basics, principles of accessible video design today. If you're somebody who would benefit from having my speaking notes to follow along with right now, or having the slides with speaking notes to look at, I've made those available with links here. The speaking notes are at tinyurl.com/VR5SJ4, and the slides are available with notes at tinyurl.com/JRD3XCE8. And if anybody wants to take a minute to do that, I'll just ask a question to kind of fill in a bit of time for that. And what I'm wondering is what anybody else's experiences are with producing video in an academic context. So for example, my most recent video projects have involved creating some tutorial videos. I used the program Camtasia to do that, and then they were published on YouTube. Does anybody else in the room have a recent example of a video that they've made? Okay, I've got a bunch of blank slates to work with. Fantastic. This is my agenda for today. After this intro, I'm going to move through sort of 3 different categories of disabilities and go over some common barriers that you'll find in video content for people with those disabilities. And then I'll offer also some solutions to those common barriers. What you're not seeing here probably is a section on technicalities of editing or any particular software or program. These are more broadly applicable principles that you can use no matter what kind of video you're making. And then I'm going to end with a few tips for testing videos for accessibility and a couple of takeaways. So when we talk about things being accessible, we're talking about if they're easy to use, comprehend, or obtain. And accessibility, generally, we're referring to how well places or things accommodate people of varying abilities. And so when I'm talking about accessible video design, we're thinking about if the video content we're producing is able to accommodate people with a wide range of abilities and needs. So I'd like to start by encouraging a perspective shift. And I think often we think about accessibility as sort of like a final step in a process to making something. And it's only something we have to do to help like a few people who have very specific needs. Maybe someone is making a video, they're instructing a class, and they're even thinking, well, I don't need to worry about accessibility here because I know that none of my students have accommodations in this class, so I don't need to think about these principles. But actually, if instead we can start to think, designing according to these principles is going to be better for anyone who's consuming our content. And that's just because when we use accessible principles or universal design principles, we end up with content that is more clear in general and just easier to consume. And we want accessibility to be part of our planning process from the beginning. It's much easier to incorporate these things going along than it is to modify an already finished product afterwards. So as I go through any of these, talking about specific disabilities, remember that there's going to be a spectrum of experience. So, some people are born with disabilities, others develop them after an illness or with age. And there's also always going to be a range of abilities within any of these conditions. Sometimes disability is permanent, other times it's temporary. So in terms of common visual disabilities and then barriers that exist to people with that disability, we would have something like color blindness. So some people who experience color blindness or color vision deficiency can't distinguish between certain colors like red and green, or they may have lowered ability to see the difference in shades of any color. And then some people can't see any color at all. A barrier to people experiencing color blindness in a video would be contrast that's been made without content that's been made without high levels of contrast between foreground and background colors. So when you see yellow text on a blue background, green text on a gray background, neon colors and things like ombre shading through fonts can look really attractive to some people, but then to other people they become completely illegible. Then we have people with low vision. So these could be people with blurry vision, a limited field of vision or clouded vision, and they may rely on scaling content to make it visible. So when you have images or text that are not resizable in things, this can be a barrier to people with low vision. And then we would have people who have substantial and uncorrectable vision loss, and this would be referred to as blindness. So they would often rely on screen reading software and images with alternate text or videos with captions and descriptive audio. So a descriptive audio track would be something that describes what's happening visually in the video so you can follow along without being able to see it. So if things are lacking any of those features, then they may be inaccessible to someone who is blind. I have an example here of an Ishihara color blindness test plate. And this image is a circle made up of various shades of green dots, and it has the number 45 in shades of red dots inside of it. This would be an example of something that someone who is colorblind couldn't see at all. But I think it's also an example of how these principles will make content better for anyone, because even if you don't personally identify as being colorblind, it's not actually very easy to make out that number 45. So using images with high contrast usually translate to a better experience for everyone. So in terms of design tips for making visually accessible videos, we want to think about always using high contrast colors, avoiding certain color combinations like red, green, green, gray, and blue, purple. I put fonts here, but it actually does apply in several areas of accessibility, but in general we want to use accessible fonts, by which I mean things which are simple. A lot of times this is sans serif fonts, but just in general anything that is sort of a straightforward clean font, lacking a lot of curlicues or those types of fonts that are supposed to look like handwriting, avoiding that kind of thing as those can be more difficult to read. When you're including image files, try to make them high resolution so that they're easy to resize. And this one is really important. You want to provide thorough narrative description of anything that's happening in the video. So for example, you're demonstrating a skill, don't just navigate away from one web page onto another, explain that you're doing so. Don't say click here, say click the blue contact me button in the top right of the page. So just giving a lot of description so anyone who isn't able to see what you're doing will be able to still understand whatever process it is that you're going through. Moving on to auditory disabilities and barriers. So in terms of auditory disabilities, we could have anyone who's experiencing full or partial loss of hearing in one ear. or complete hearing loss in both ears, or even people who just have problems understanding speech if there's also background noise going on at the same time. And some common barriers in videos for these disabilities would be low quality audio recordings, so with a lot of interference or static in the background. Videos where the volume is not adjustable can be inaccessible, and particularly one of the biggest barriers to video content for people who are hard of hearing or who are deaf are a lack of captions. So I have here an example of what you might call a closed captioning fail. This is two white men. They look like they're Christmas caroling probably, but the caption on the screen reads, "Read off the rent those reindeer." And I think probably they wanted Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer. That's not what is on the screen. So this one's kind of funny, and I found it in actually like a list that was called Funny Caption Fails by a company that professionally generates captions. But you know, a lot of the times these captioning inaccuracies or mistakes are just really frustrating for someone who's relying on this content in order to understand a video. And one place that I've seen myself that can be really bad is something like a news broadcast. I find that their live generated captions are so bad that if you were relying on those captions, you actually wouldn't be getting the news at all. So all that is to say, if you're able to, you want to generate your own captions whenever possible, or at least have the ability to edit an auto-generated caption. So more design tips for considering auditory disabilities. We want to speak clearly and at a moderate pace. Don't include background music or background noise in your videos. If you're speaking during a video, trying to put music underneath that speech track, as this can be distracting or can make what you're saying incomprehensible to some people. Provide video transcripts if you can't provide captions. And then the big one is captioning. There's a lot to consider here. So first of all, you always want to make sure that your captions are synced to what's going on in the video so that the audio matches up with what's happening. You want to think about making sure that no important information is appearing in the same space as you'll find your captions on the bottom of the video. And you want to make captions about 2 lines long for maximum comprehensibility. You also want to think about open captions versus closed captions. So open captions are when the caption is part of the video, full stop, you can't turn it off. And closed captions are when the captions can be toggled on and off. So some people argue that open captions are better as it makes it just sort of a default and then everyone's experience is the same. Other people think that closed are better because some people with cognitive disabilities might actually find closed captions make it difficult for them to understand what's happening in a video. In which case, what one article that I read by Clausen argues is that making something have closed captions that default to being on and then allowing people to turn them off is probably the most accessible option. So moving on to cognitive disabilities and barriers. This is a really broad category, but it includes things like intellectual disabilities, where maybe somebody doesn't have the ability to master complex concepts, learning disabilities like dyslexia or other disorders that make it difficult to process sensory information, and mental health conditions like anxiety. And so some common barriers for these disabilities would be unnecessarily complex language or a lot of jargon use, long speeches or passages of text that appear without anything to explain what the key concepts are. Again, unnecessary elements of background audio, unusual structures or layouts, sort of unexpected content delivery, time limits on videos, and flashing or blinking content. So as an example here, I've got something you would never want to see in a video, just this wall of text It's got nothing to show what's important in all of this. It's in this really decorative font that makes it harder to read. And also in this case, it's in Latin, which I'm guessing is not super accessible to anybody in the room right now. But even in English, something like this would cause cognitive overload for a lot of people and would make your content inaccessible. So in terms of cognitively accessible design, we want to think about things like using simple vocabulary, avoiding jargon, and if you do need to use a technical term, give a definition. Organize your content purposefully and in a logical way. So if you have set up what you're going to do, make sure you follow things in that order. Break your text and your concepts into manageable chunks. So avoiding big walls of text, but also thinking in terms of chunking concepts can be very good for accessibility. So, you know, for a library example, if I'm making a skills video, I'm not going to make one that shows you how to choose keywords, how to search in the catalog, how to read a call number, how to retrieve a physical book, and how to navigate this commons space all in one video. I'm going to choose one single skill per video so that people can digest that information more manageably. As you're making your video, think about providing a mix of oral and visual explanation. Highlight key concepts or items. A lot of video will allow you to do that by adding in shapes that are pointing out important things, or even like a literal highlight function. And you want to leave out unnecessary graphics or animations in your videos. Once you have a video that you've been designing this way, or maybe you're doing an audit of video content that you've inherited or that you have already, a couple of things you can do for testing, which could be helpful. First time through, turn off your monitor, or if you can't do that, you're working on a laptop, close your eyes, and play through the video. See, is the narrative sufficiently descriptive that I can understand the message of this video without looking at it? Then play through another time with no audio, checking for the same thing. Do you have captions that are correct? Are they synced? Is the content understandable without the audio? And then finally, you can either compile your own checklist or find a checklist of things to go through with these videos. And I would recommend having at least 2 people do each video, because in any kind of proofreading, you want to have more than one set of eyes. Someone might miss something that somebody else picks up. And so having a checklist would allow you to be sure as you go through your video that you're hitting, or rather avoiding, these common barriers to accessibility. So key takeaways today are just that all users who could be looking at your video have varying abilities. There are many possible barriers to content. And when we make accessible videos, they're more understandable for everyone. And finally, you know, simple perspective shift and some planning, and you can make your own accessible video content. Thanks. Did I stop sharing?
You're good now. Everything's good.
Okay.
Back to the room webcam. The floor is open to any questions, either virtually or in person here.
I have some questions about the copyright work.
Right.
Is it okay for us to contact authors of books and papers if the university doesn't have access to them, so that we can get a copy of it?
It's best to contact the publisher. The author often, if it's a published book, the distribution rights of that content go to the publisher. So it's, you know, it's certainly worth coming to the library first, because we can bring it in under sort of one of those library archives and museums research exceptions. But other than that, it would be you legally it's the requirement to go to the publisher and ask for that material, because the author has signed it over to be published. Yeah, unless it has that Creative Commons sign on the bottom of it, that's hopefully we see more of. But generally, it's the publisher that owns the rights.
Nicole, thanks so much for your presentation, and I'll be going back to those slides to make myself a checklist. I'm just wondering, if you're setting up a course in D2L, are there any tools there for captioning lecture videos that you're posting and stuff like that? Like, do you know what's in there? I don't know what's in there because I'm brand new to all this. But
I don't think that D2L has their own tools, but it depends. So you have a couple options in D2L for how you're adding videos. It's often at the first step, like Panopto is an option, I think, for D2L. And they would have their own setup for captions. If you're creating YouTube videos, YouTube's captions are actually fairly decent and they're editable. But it's often not at the point that you're uploading the video to D2L that you'd be having to add the captions, but like as you're recording it.
What about Teams? Like if you're co-lecturing on Teams, you're recording that co-lecture and then you're throwing it on D2L. What's your best pathway to making sure that that is?
That's a great question because the Teams captions are auto-generated.
Yeah.
And that is better than nothing. But one thing that you might consider, depending on how you plan your lecture content, is also adding a transcript of speaking notes, or at least an outline of the content. You could also, like, as you're going through the video, since the captions are auto-generated, if you notice any that are particularly bad, you could add that to your class notes as sort of corrections. You can't actually edit these captions, I don't think, but you can sort of at least say at 15 minutes when I say Rudolph and it translated it as read those, I meant Rudolph.
And just one last question on that. Is there like one program that is best known for like creating transcripts from audio files or video files?
I mean, there's a pretty wide variety. There's more available all the time now. And there's different options in terms of paid or free services. The paid ones are usually better than the free ones. Although YouTube's is free. And so I guess like if you were in the position where that was your best option, you could make a separate YouTube account for these and upload your course videos, get the captions that way, and embed links. I think that would work in D2L.
Thank you.
I have a question for Richelle. What can we do to, I don't know, decrease the publication bias, like as students, readers?
As researchers, publication bias. It's a hard thing to solve. A lot of it's just going to take time. I think a lot of publication bias is actually at the publishing level. They don't publish negative results, which means things don't get published that way.
Yeah, and you don't try again, like in a different publisher or different journal, because you were already rejected, right? So it's like, now that I have like, I don't know, I did this project, I have my findings and results, and nobody cares about that because I found nothing, or
Yeah,
it's still important.
And that problem of not publishing negative results is very, very significant in journals, because people do a study 20 times. One time it comes out right, because 1 in 20, depending on your field, that one gets published. So suddenly this thing that really doesn't happen is people think it happens. So it's a very, like, I was reading a study when I was doing this PowerPoint, which I've read before, where they tried to replicate 53 of the fundamental cancer biology research studies, and was successful in replicating only 6. Like, there's some really appalling statistics there. And I think a lot of it is due diligence by the researchers. A lot of it's going to be a culture change in publishing. And a lot of it is just that reliance on multiple converging points of evidence to prove a point. Scary though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there are no online questions coming in, I've certainly learned a lot this afternoon, and I hope folks here in the room and at home have as well. Thanks very much to our presenters and to attendees. There'll be another booster session coming into December, and then we'll be wrapping up for the semester. So for those of you joining us synchronously, have a great weekend and a safe, restive, and productive reading week. And goodbye.